Hello, I'm Robert, and I'm the founder of Doomsday Debunked, where we help people who are scared of many things, such as, for instance, climate change, by telling them, helping them to find out the truth, whatever it might be. No sugarcoating, but just telling it as it is. And so many of them, since last year, are absolutely terrified of climate change, and it's awful. They're suicidal sometimes. And it's because of all these exaggerated mainstream media stories, and also the Extinction Rebellion are no small part of the reason for it. And so it was great just the other day to see some climate scientists at last speaking up about it. And here Dr. Tamsin Edwards saying, "Rupert, I am shocked at this talk. Please stop telling children that they may not grow up due to climate change. It is wrong, and deflects from the fact it is poor people who are at risk due to inequality exacerbated by shifts in weather." So I had to listen to that, and it was absolutely awful what he was saying to these children. I mean, from the people I help via PMs and in our group, and some of them will have gone home sobbing, and they will be needing therapy, and they may be suicidal, and they may have been unable to work and some of them would consider leaving a job. Sometimes even get parents considering, not seriously, but they really think that maybe they'd be better off if both themselves and their children were dead when they hear what these people have to say to them. It's absolutely awful. And I spent so much time helping these people that just terrified some of them. And here he is, he talked to them, and he'd said these awful things to them, and from the title, it actually says, this is an example of how, he presents an example. Where have I got the title? See if I can find it. How I Talk with Children About Climate Breakdown. And he was talking to school children. And here's some of the things he said. What are you going to do if you grow up? If you grow up, you reach a point where there just isn't enough food. That's the kind of thing that's likely to happen, very likely to happen during your lifetimes. He went on to say that there's unless everything changes and really fast, there isn't going to be a future. We're on the path to collapse of our civilization, to not being enough food on the table, to not having a future. This is not true at all. And he goes on to talk about many crops in this country, their yields were down by a third. Well, if you go and check, first of all, what is the EU most known for? What do we do most? Well, it's cereals. Crops like wheat, barley and oats and so on. Look, you can see in the EU, we're one of the main producers of wheat, of barley and of oats. What we don't do much of, even though we're a little bit famous for it's Ireland, that really are the potatoes. Only 2% is potatoes. And then other things, other arable crops, 3%. And we produce some onions, amongst other things. And there was a significant reduction of onions and potatoes this year. But look at who produces most of the onions. If we go and look at the place here, then which colour is the onions? Onions are blue. And Spain is one of the main producers of onions, and the Netherlands. And then as well as that, Turkey's a pretty good. Turkey's a big producer of onions. It's obviously not too hot for onions in the UK. If you're producing them in Turkey and Spain, that's not a climate change thing. I mean, it could be. It's very likely it was affected by the drought, by the heat wave, which led to drought, which led to small onions. But that is partly because we're not used to growing our onions in those dry conditions. Either the type of onion, or maybe they're not irrigated properly. But we certainly can do it in much warmer conditions. And so there's the onion news, and how one particular person's he has seen a fall of 50% for his onions in Suffolk. But look at the crop yields generally. We've had a big up in 2019. Wheat production increased by 20%. And the yield per hectare was also higher, 9 above the 5-year average, and spring barley's increased by 90.1%, oats, and that's up by 19.9% to 6 tonnes per hectare, and an increase in production increase of 27.2%. And wheat, that's up 20% on 2018. And so he's saying that this, I'll get into this some more, he's saying that being a bit short of onions 1 year he's claiming that this is the reason why we are severe risk of all dying. If you come down to it, that's the only fact he gives on food. I'll talk a bit more about what the real situation is, and it's not true at all. And then he goes and talks about planes, and he says you need to say, he's saying that our countries are not living up to the pledges that we've made. The UK, of course, has pledged to zero emissions by 2050. Now, there are people criticising the government, saying they're not doing enough, but the Committee for Climate Change has worked out a perfectly worked out plan. It's not the only way to do it. There are likely to be several different ways. We don't necessarily follow their plan, but they have a way to get to zero emissions by 2050. And they do not say that it's impossible to get to zero emissions if you expand the airports. So this is what he said. You might have heard that there are plans to expand most of the airports in this country. He says if those plans go ahead, there's just absolutely no way we can meet our targets under international climate agreements. And if we don't meet those targets, then our weather is going to spin out of control. We're going to have more heat waves, and they're going to get worse. It's going to go on and on. So aviation worldwide amounts to 2% of global emissions. And of course, UK aviation is only a tiny fraction of worldwide aviation. How is a tiny fraction of 2% of global emissions going to cause our weather to spin out of control? And the aviation industry worldwide is committed to carbon neutral growth from 2020, and then to cut CO2 emissions by half to 5 levels by 2050. It's one of the very few global industries to do such a thing. It's very difficult to get all the way down to zero emissions with planes, but we can reduce it even with increasing number of flights. And then when we get with very reduced plane emissions, then we can offset the rest. We can offset a few percent of our CO2 emissions without doing anything, without even using biofuel emission and carbon capture and storage. We can just do it by planting trees, improving our soils, which takes up carbon dioxide, and we can do it by even by improving things like seagrass and growing seaweeds in the oceans. There are many ways that we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And we need to do, and the planet is actually greening already, and we need to work on that, make sure it continues greening, and that it does it significantly. Then we can offset the flying, and we can, and those reductions, the way they can reduce emissions while increasing the number of flights, is, for instance, by using carbon neutral fuel, and Audi is already doing that, but they can also do it by using biofuel, which they and from agricultural waste and from algae, which is algae is a very young technology and they haven't quite got it yet. And there's also electric powered planes, and we already have these electric powered planes starting up in Norway. There's a startup. This is an actual electric powered plane. I'll run the video and you can watch it flying. We actually have batteries that are good enough. I might have to switch the sound off. Yes, so this is a plane that is powered on batteries. It's quite a small plane, but it shows how our electric batteries, how much they're improving. This wouldn't have been possible before. And so it's going to work with, this is just a very small demo plane, but eventually they hope to be able to do it with half a dozen passengers in the early 2020s. And so there they are, they're taking off and they're flying in an electric powered plane, and the first very small prototype, and those two people are quite literally flying in a plane powered on batteries. And so Norway plans, and battery technology is improving rapidly, very fast reduction in cost and improvement in storage capacity, and the many types of batteries that it's not necessarily the lithium ion that we're so familiar with. There's several other ones that are on the way that are not quite ready yet, but they're likely to be ready quite soon. But it's very promising. We don't know where this is headed. It's certainly, we expect to have short-haul flights with small numbers of people, and in Norway, of course, all the fjords and everything, they have many short-distance flights to do, so it's a natural place. Lots of rural places with small populations in amongst the fjords and big mountains that they want to fly, mountainous regions to fly over. It's no surprise that Norway, which is also very ahead in renewables, is leading the way and has a plan for a fleet of electric planes. And I go into a lot of detail there. I could bring it up, but this is just enough to show that what he's saying is just utter nuts. Just don't pay any attention to that. Now, in a tweet, he then goes on and he says he's a friend and colleague of Jem Bendel. By the way, I mean he's a certainly reputable academic. I don't want to diss him as an academic. He's a philosopher, and I dare say he's very good at philosophy, and he works on the precautionary principle. But sadly, a whole lot of people have decided to kind of come in on climate change as if they knew everything, and just ignore the IPCC, who are the people who they do a top-level systematic review. It's very, very hard for someone who comes in as an outsider who hasn't studied climate change to get a good view of the subject, and the IPCC is the way in. But these people, they just ignore them and they listen to junk scientists, and people are just saying nonsense, they believe them. So I'm not saying he obviously believes it. He goes on to say that he's so later on in one of his articles, he says he's so convinced that civilization is going to collapse that he has bought bulletproof vests for himself and his partner because he thinks our civilization is going to collapse and that UK is not going to be a safe place to live in without a bulletproof vest. You may not know, but in the UK, guns are very rare indeed. So that's a really rather striking and shocking thing for someone to say who's a UK lecturer. We don't have gun crime here, not to speak of. It's knife crime, yes, a bit, but not very, very rare. I've never seen, I don't know if I've actually seen a working gun in real life myself. Farmers have them, but they hardly, some farmers, most farmers wouldn't, I don't think. And or some farmers do, and I don't know, maybe farmers do, but and sportsmen, and that's about it. You don't see people going around the streets carrying guns, even policemen. Most policemen do not carry guns here. And so now this paper that he's looking at, the Jem Bendel, he is an absolutely appalling paper again. Again, I can't really speak for the sociology, but the science is bizarre, weird. He quotes a non-peer-reviewed talk given by a systems analyst to a group of business advisors, two business advisors, Sue Cheshire and Kent Allen, whoever they are. It's the academy run by them, and one of them run this little group. The systems analyst went and talked to that group about climate change, wrote it down in a blog post, put that up. Then Jem Bendel goes and reads that blog post, which says bizarre things about the climate, and then uses that as his cite in his paper. And there's no surprise at all that his paper was rejected for peer review. I mean, that's just not how you do an academic paper, especially citing someone who is not even in your field of expertise, him being a sociologist, and his main site on climate change is a blog post by a system analyst writing down his talk that he gave to some businessmen. I mean, I'd say it's utterly bizarre. It's weird. You wouldn't believe it. And so I say it's no wonder it was rejected. And now Rupert Reed, he's a colleague of this Jem Bendel, and as he said up here, does he say up here? No, but he says it in the talk, the thing I clicked through to. And so now he goes and explains that's about why they the sociologists rejected the article because it didn't adhere to the standards of peer review. And now Richard Reed's post. In his article he supports Jem Bendel, but he claims not to be a catastrophist because he thinks there's a chance we don't head to catastrophe. In other words, he's buying his bulletproof vests, but he doesn't think it's absolutely certain that he's going to need them, and because of that he claims not to be a catastrophist. And so now look at a couple of points. First of all, he says the situation is particularly grim in the Arctic. The albedo loss there is highly disturbing, threatening itself to blow the IPCC scenario away, as Jem details this in his junk paper. Right, this looks, so this is the idea that as the Arctic ice melts, then the sea is a lot darker than ice. And because of that, then it absorbs more heat. And you can see here in this map, you can see the reddish-orange area up there, but it's not just the Arctic, some places here as well are somewhat reddish-orange. This is the change from 2000 to 2012, shown in colour, and red is a 20% increase, 15 is a 15%, blue is a 15% decrease. And the So I mean, you may immediately tell where I'm going with this, but I'll go through it anyway. But first of all, the reduction in the reflectiveness in the Arctic is not as much as you'd think, because there's an awful lot of cloud there, and there's even more cloud over open sea. And also, of course, the albedo doesn't really make such a big difference in the Arctic anyway, because half the year is total darkness, and even in summer the sun doesn't get that high. Obviously it's going to make no difference for half the year, because what's the matter if it's bright or dark if there's no sunlight? So it's not as effective up there as it would be down there anyway. And then over the open sea, you have clouds over the open sea. And more clouds, as it turns out, the more we've had the sea melting, and the ice is there all except in the middle of the summer, for a month or two in summer. And during that time, then you get more clouds over the sea than you would anyway. So clouds don't reflect as much as ice, that's quite true. It does get a little bit darker, as you can see here. It's quite clear that the Arctic is getting a little bit less reflective over the last decade. But there are these other areas that are getting much more reflective, off Australia and Malaysia. And if you work out, and the green areas are also more reflective. And if you add up, the northern hemisphere already actually over the last decade has got slightly more reflective, reflecting way more sunlight, especially in the tropics, which is where it matters most. And the southern hemisphere as a whole has got a lot more reflective in the last decade, because there's no Arctic to kind of compensate. The Antarctica is very steady in temperature in comparison. So this whole thing about the albedo of the Arctic, you get these junk papers that take the albedo over the entire Arctic, say there's been this change over the last decade, then they average that over the entire world and claim it's an increase in temperature of the entire world. It is not. An increase in a decrease in the reflectivity of the entire world, and it is not. The entire world has become more reflective with global warming. So this is just nuts. Again, I mean, it's not his fault, he's not a climate scientist, but he shouldn't rely on this sort of thing. He obviously doesn't have very much even basic science to be believing this sort of thing. And sadly, there are quite a few people like that who pronounce on climate change, and he's been convinced by someone or other who's told him that, and he hasn't looked it up, he hasn't checked. He maybe doesn't know how to check something like that. You can be an expert in philosophy and just not know how to check a scientific paper. So it's not a valid, I say it's not a valid way to argue, it simply isn't. This is an example of a scientist who ignored that. And he actually got a comment directly on his paper, by his first version of his paper, this scientist, saying, this doesn't work, look, the globe is getting more reflective. And he just ignored that comment and there's no mention of it in his second paper on the same topic. And when someone does that, if someone criticizes you, it's an easy way to classify something immediately as being junk science. That is pretty much the definition of junk science, that you just follow your own little rut, and you don't ignore you ignore all the objections to it. And someone raises loads of objections, you don't even mention them in your paper. That means that's not high quality science. And the IPCC, quite rightly, will not be including stuff like that in their report. And the people who criticise the IPCC and say, why didn't you include this paper that said that the an ice-free summer Arctic will have the same effect as 25 years of CO2 emissions? And the reason they don't is because it doesn't stand up to the quality of what they're looking for in a climate science report. So when people say things like that, the IPCC, they don't just check the range of views in the literature, they check that it's decent science, because there are, sadly, many people who don't do decent science. Only a tiny minority, but out of thousands of scientists, I don't know how many, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands probably, then you get one or two who do this sort of stuff, and the IPCC, of course, will not cover that. So you shouldn't complain when they're not covering junk science. And they say this: sea ice is often cited as a tipping point in the climate system, but detailed modelling suggests that summer sea ice can return within a few years after its artificial removal for climates in the late 20th and 21st century. So in other words, as soon as, and they suggest that it's neither irreversible nor exhibit bifurcation behaviour. Bifurcation behaviour means that it's got two states. Too cold, at certain stages it's frozen over, and if you melt it, it's not going to go back to be frozen again. But Arctic ice doesn't do that. Once it's all melted, it'll, as soon as you remove the CO2, then it'll cool down again exactly the way that it went up. And so it is therefore plausible that the extent of Arctic sea ice may quickly re-equilibrate to the end of century climate under an overshoot scenario. What that means is that if we were to go over to the point where at 2 degrees C, at 1.5 degrees C, the Arctic ice will melt every 100 years or so. The Arctic will be ice-free about once per 100 years. By the time you get to 2C, it's much more often, every decade or two. But if you then cool down, go back to 1.5C, then you will go back to that once every century melt. And you will sometimes read the blue ocean, blue oxygen event. This is utter junk science. That claims that they make this claim that once the Arctic is ever completely ice-free with no ice left, then they say it's never going to melt, ever again, and the whole world will very quickly warm up. This is, again, absolute utter nuts. When the ice is, when you get an ice-free Arctic, then it's going to freeze more rapidly, because the ice actually covers the sea and protects it from the freezing temperatures above, and it keeps it warm. And when it's ice-free, it will lose its heat much more easily. So, when you have the first ice-free Arctic, then after that, then there's of course no 2-year-old ice left anymore, no 3-year-old ice left anymore. But all the young ice will go very quickly, and so it's not very likely that the next year will be ice-free, because it's got a lot of ice that's grown in the previous, as a result of it being clear the previous year. So it almost works the other way around. It's certainly not going to be the case that a first ice-free year is going to lead to it becoming warmer ice-free, and in winter it makes no sense at all, because in complete darkness, of course the sea will freeze. On any scenario, the Arctic winter is definitely going to be frozen ice. Because there's no sunlight to keep it warm, and sea ice, you may not know maybe some of you won't know, but seawater freezes just as ordinary ice does. If you put your water in a fridge, it freezes. If you put seawater in the cold enough fridge, it'll freeze as well. So we aren't headed for a world without sea ice. Then he goes on to this methane time bomb thing, and that used to be believed, but then that's not true either. That's been discredited. There's a couple of scientists who keep on saying it in a junk science way, ignoring all their critics, but it's completely discredited now. It's not really credible. And so there's no doubt that all that methane exists there, but it's not going to destabilize quickly like they used to think was possible. Anyway, but look at this, what he says. We're looking not only at the end of human civilization, but the possible extinction of humanity and of most animals. He's talking there about maybe a 10 degrees C rise, if they had been right, which they're not. You're talking about maybe coconuts in the Med. You're not talking about coconuts in Greenland, even if you had this methane thing happen. And how are human beings going to go extinct? I mean, I don't know. These people just don't think, I think. They don't kind of... They're very much in the ideas. They're affected by the ideas, and they don't connect it to the real world very clearly. Because, and they just get caught up in these fantastic, fascinating ideas, and the idea of humans being extinct, which for some reason seems to fascinate them. But it's just absolutely impossible, because human beings can live anywhere, from the Kalahari all the way through Siberia and Alaska, and the Eskimos in ice, and of course we're more interested in the warming conditions, but the Eskimos, I mean, it's never going to get Greenland as warm as the Kalahari Desert, and we can eat insects, and we can eat roots and seeds and shellfish. Early human beings in North America, for instance, they built these huge mounds and mounds of shellfish because that was their staple diet for quite a long time, at a certain stage when we lived around the coastlines. And shellfish are a very easy thing to get year-round in the high latitudes. That was our staple, going back and back in Northern Europe. So, I mean, that doesn't even make sense that humans could go extinct. It's absolutely... So the very name of Extinction Rebellion it doesn't make sense. Literally doesn't make sense. And that's even without any technology. And look at our modern technology. We can build habitats on the moon. I mean, if someone says that climate change is going to make humans extinct, then just look at them askance and wonder how, and it shows that they're just caught up in a world of spinning ideas, and they are not connecting it with the actual reality, down to earth, basic groundedness of what our world is really like. They're just spinning away in a little intellectual whirlwind or tornado, and they've lost all contact with reality when they say that. But anyway, back to this methane bomb thing. Then, already in December 2016, there's a major big project, the USGS Hydrates project. These are methane hydrates. This is a project to study the methane hydrates by the USGS, which big major in the United States Geological Survey. And they did a big review, and they came to the conclusion that evidence was lacking. In 2017, the Royal Society came to the same conclusion. And in 2018, the Annual Review of Environment and Resources on Methane Global said that, again, in very similar conclusion. If you look at the abstract of that, it looks a little bit different, because the abstract isn't very clear, but if you go and read the paper, then you see this. And it seems unlikely. The Wikipedia article quotes the abstract and misunderstands that paper, because it's behind a paywall, maybe. And then in 2018, the Cage Research Group, they came to a much stronger conclusion. They found evidence that methane clathrates have been formed 6 million years ago and been slowly releasing methane for 2 million years, and with hardly any variation between warm and cold. So it wasn't recent as they previously thought. In the 2019 report, that's only just out this autumn, they came to a similar conclusion. That they also found that they no longer talk about clathrates anymore, and it's over. That's past history now. They're looking at methane emissions from the permafrost and the lakes and so on, which is not nearly as much. And they just don't even consider the other stuff anymore, not because they're ignoring it, but because it's just not a factor. And they cited this paper by Christensen, which looked at the methane emissions from anthropogenic emissions and then compared it with the natural emissions, worst case. And first of all, this is the range of. So now I'm not talking about the methane gun anymore. I mean, that's over. But I'm talking about the some methane. I'm not saying there's no methane from the seas. There are some, and there's a bubbling. There was a great story about how they found 5 square meters of sea that was bubbling with methane, and you do get little patches of methane like that in the sea. But 5 square meters of methane is not going to tip our climate. And there's a certain low level, but most of it, on its way up from the seabed, dissolves in the ocean, and it's all gone by the time it gets to the surface anyway, unless it's very close to the surface. And then only the surface layers of it can be unstable, and only for a few months of the year. And it's when you work through all that that's when you find out, and that's why the USGS came to that conclusion. And so now this is looking at the various models of the methane over the just carbon generally, not just methane. It's carbon of the soil carbon, but also from the context, I think it also includes it says northern lakes, ponds, wetland ecosystems, and the shallow Arctic Ocean shelves, which is where the methane hydrates are. And if you look at it, then some of them say this is moderate emissions and this is high emissions, which is business as usual, which we're surely not on. But it's hard to see how we can be on that. And as you see, many of the studies come to it actually being a sink. Those ones, the studies that say it's a sink, they don't hit the news. The ones that say it's going to be a big emission, it's going to be a source, they're the ones that hit the news. But we're still getting studies saying it's a sink. And we can't really decide yet between one and the other. There was a recent one that came to the conclusion that it's a source, but it had enough error so it could still be a sink. And that's the most recent thorough one, not on that diagram. And so we don't actually know for sure. It's very hard to tell because as the permafrost melts, then the microbes will grow. In the Arctic permafrost, it's not talking about methane clathrates, it's talking about buried organics from back when before it froze. Grass and little animals and stuff like that. And then as it melts, what happens to those? What microbes eat them makes all the difference. And whether it happens deep below water and whether the soil is dry or wet. There are many variables, and it's very, very hard to be sure exactly what's going to happen, which is why it's so hard to model. But now this is that paper that looked at it, and we can do things as well by managing it in various ways. For instance, they have these fires. Maybe if you contain the fires or you let them burn, and you can have also draining, and you can block rivers and streams to create peat bogs and things. So there are ways you can manage the Arctic as well if needs be. And the peat bogs take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, for instance, you see, and maybe if you've got a peat bog, the methane's not going to get all the way up. So there are all sorts of it's difficult to know what exactly is going to happen. But now this is looking at, these are the this is observed historical methane emissions. It's this methane concentration in parts per billion. These are predictions, and for different increases in natural emissions. So this is no increase. So this is just human emissions, right? Because human emissions of methane are increasing. That's from things like our farms and so on. And then if we were to have the 150 teragrams of methane, that takes you up to there. But now look at what happens if we do our best effort to reduce our human emissions. This is based on current policies. And if we have improved policies, as we should be doing, as we work towards zero emissions, then we get down there. Add even the worst possible case of 150 teragrams per year, then we get up to there, which is not high, far above what we are at now. And the difference between those two is far less than the difference between there and there as a result of reducing human emissions. So they conclude that the conclusion was that if we keep to existing legislation, then with no increase in natural emissions, they almost double. And with the maximum reduction, then the emission levels decrease in all except the extreme methane emissions scenario. Which doesn't actually this extreme doesn't correspond to any particular temperature, because they don't know what is going to happen at different temperatures. But that's not very likely even on the pathway we are on now. That's more likely to be business as usual for that one. So this whole idea that methane is going to cause huge problems for our climate, and that's just gone out of the window. I mean, it is significant. We're talking about even like the difference between that and that. I mean, it's still going to be equivalent to maybe some small country, or maybe even more, depending how much you're going in terms of emissions. But it is not going to lead us to us spiraling out of control. And as you say, with a committed global effort, we can compensate for just about all the effect of any increase in natural emissions, even with the extreme scenario. Then it's nearly all. Then reducing anthropic emissions has far more effect on climate change than even the extreme scenario. Anyway, so now based on his belief in a methane bomb and in an Arctic albedo effect transforming the climate, both of which are junk science as we now know, then he says, that if in 2028 we are somehow still standing, then people will come back and refer negatively to GEM's 10 years semi-prediction. I mean, they're referring to it negatively now. Climate scientists don't. It's just nonsense, as I said. This is not just me. Any climate scientist. Michael Mann just said he's only got 4 letters for it. Crap. That's how he summarised it. That's his review. One word. So anyway, and this is a bit about saying he's bought a bulletproof vest, and he's saying that he's acting precautiously, and that's the precautionary principle. However, now he's an expert on the precautionary principle as philosophy, and this is his summary. It is applied in circumstances where there are reasonable grounds for concern. Reasonable grounds for concern is important, reasonable. That an activity could cause harm, but there's uncertainty about the probability of the risk and the degree of harm, and some gaps in the information currently available. And so, for instance, take the example of the San Francisco Bridge, and I'll bring that up in this thing. Then, the San Francisco Bridge is built to withstand earthquakes and tsunamis. It was originally not sufficiently designed for the earthquakes, but they did a retrofit, and it's now, it'll take a while to come up. Here we are in the San Francisco Bridge. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. The Golden Gate Bridge, which, by the way, it's that colour because that was the colour of the original primer. And then the architect looked at it and said, "Oh, fantastic colour! I'll make the whole bridge that colour." And it's slightly changed, but it's based on the original primer of some of the girders that were used for it. Anyway, yes. It's not quite a short article there, but this is a bit about how the final phase, it is now already been retrofitted, so even if you had the big one in San Francisco, then the bridge will be safe. Even if you're standing on the bridge, you'll be okay, even if you get the big one. But it would be, if they haven't done the final stage, the stage 3B, which would make it safe, would mean you could reuse it immediately after a major earthquake. So that means that there would be a long period of reconstruction. It would be closed for quite a long time if they ever have the big one, which is something like, I think, 7% chance in 40 years or something. It's not very, it's quite low, but it is a possibility, depending on what you mean by the big one, magnitude 8. Anyway, so it makes sense to engineer the San Francisco Bridge, in this case retro-engineer, because they found it wasn't quite well engineered enough to withstand an earthquake, even if it's only a 7% chance. But it doesn't make sense to engineer it to withstand a 300-foot high tsunami. If you've ever watched the San Andreas Fault movie, then the 300-foot tsunami San Andreas, then the actual San Andreas fault is on land and it slips sideways instead of vertically. And that means that there's really zero risk of a tsunami at all from that. There are some other earth faults that could cause a tsunami, but not that one. And the ones that could cause a tsunami, maybe, I mean, the worst is 50 foot high. It's not, but I think, I'm not sure, I would have to look up the numbers, but you're not talking about a risk of a mega tsunami. It's not a significant risk in San Francisco. But the and 300-foot one is absolutely impossible. I've got a little quote here from someone. This was a seismologist, Lucy Jones, and reported by CBS News. She tweeted as she was watching San Andreas, and when it got to the tsunami, she says, "Here's where we start entering fantasy territory. Tsunamis are not cresting waves. They can't be bigger than the ocean is deep." And that's when they had this 300-foot mega tsunami. It's not only impossible in terms of earthquakes, it's impossible in terms of hydrodynamics. So when you're talking about the precautionary principle, it's about reasonable, whatever they said, reasonable, where was his summary? Reasonable grounds for concern. There are no reasonable grounds of concern for a 300-foot tsunami and the Golden Gate Bridge. So the precautionary principle doesn't apply. It's exactly the same with the Arctic ice. Albedo effect, there are no reasonable grounds of concern there. There are no reasonable grounds of concern for a methane bomb. So you do not apply the precautionary principle to things that are unreasonable and are junk science. So, as a friend helped me to summarize the situation, so the IPCC is an excellent example of the precautionary principle in action. Because we could have, if we hadn't used something like the precautionary principle, we might never have set up the IPCC. We'd have just said, we have no proof of any bad effects of global warming because we haven't even looked. So let's just ignore it. The IPCC is a perfect example of the precautionary principle in action. And many of the cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically in climate change. For instance, with the coral reefs, there's a risk that 99% of them are gone at 2C. But it's not a certainty at all, because there are ways that the coral reefs can adapt. The corals, we have a wide range of different corals. I talked about that in my previous talk just now, but there are corals that are already adapted to 2C, to a couple of centigrade above pre-industrial. They happen to be in the wrong place. They're in corals that will be even warmer, and if they were in the other place, they'd be fine. So the question really is, some corals will almost any reef in the world, then even in the Red Sea is the hottest, I think, but they are already, for some reason, pre-adapted due to past history to warmer temperatures than they're going to get. And other ones, then there are other corals somewhere in the world that are already adapted to warmer temperatures. The problem is that you can't just transplant a reef from one place to the other. So the question is, how quickly will the local corals adapt to the increasing temperatures? And that's quite hard to actually know for certainty, but we have this point that probably about 99% of corals will be gone, but if it changes so quickly that we are at 2C by, say, 2040 or 2050. So in that situation, it's a perfect place for the precautionary principle, because we just can't we shouldn't take that risk, because there are millions and millions and millions of people. I think it's over 100 million, certainly. I should look up the figure, but there are lots of people who depend on the corals, and so economically it's very bad for all them. And then of course it's such wonderfully biodiverse. So this is absolutely a correct application of the precautionary principle, that we can't show for certainty that 9% will be gone. There are many gaps in the chain of reasoning, but we should take the precautions and make sure it doesn't happen. Then another example, in the Amazon, then a mass dieback is no longer looking likely, but we can still act to prevent it, and it's 100 times less expensive to act to prevent it, and we can use no-regret measures that help anyway. For instance, reducing forests and stopping deforestation. That's obviously well worth doing, whether or not it's actually there's any risk of this mass dieback. And actually, mass dieback is actually going to be more likely a very slow dieback if we do increase to about 3 degrees centigrade or something. So, but still, no matter how tiny, even there's a tiny chance of it, which it's looking very implausible now. But even if there was even if this chance is very, very small, it's still worth doing it, especially if you got no regrets measures. It's different, but it's different if you have regrets and if you have regrets type measures. So, for instance, the Committee on the Extinction Rebellion, they want us to go to a wartime footing and to massively change so we get zero emissions, massive amount of rollout of probably growing lots of trees or even biofuels. Who knows what you do? There's building wind farms and solar panels and all cars within 5 years becoming electric vehicles, and maybe these electric vehicles are going to be maybe difficult to recycle, or maybe the batteries don't last very well because we've rushed into a huge program of building so many electric vehicles so quickly in 5 years. There's vast numbers of things that could go wrong. And then there's the effect on society of people suddenly being forced to do this and how people react to that. And then at the end of that, you've got to pick up the pieces after by 2025, maybe you achieve your zero emissions with a warlike effort. But then you've got to pick up the pieces. You've got to go and maybe you've got to recycle all your cars. Maybe people are very resentful and there's a whole lot of anger and there's a whole lot of, maybe there's even rioting and so on. Like with the yellow shirts in France, yellow vests in France. So no, it's not you. That is a case of you look at the harm of your measures. Your measures are not always without consequence that you might take, your precautions. They might be very harmful in consequence. They might be, and I would say, in the case of the Extinction Rebellion's demands, I say their demands are actually far more harmful than the thing they're trying to prevent, if they really did try to do it in 2025. 2030 is more reasonable. The Bernie Sanders in the US and the Labour Party in the UK, they are looking at 2030 for zero emissions. Finland is already targeting 2035. It's not impossible that we could achieve 2030 maybe in the UK, but I don't think we should aim for that unless we're sure it's going to work. I think we first follow what the Paris Agreement said. We're going for 2050. Once you're absolutely secure on that, then go for 2030. I'm not very sure about the. But anyway, there is some reason for 2030. I'm not so sure about certainly not for 2025. And look, and here he is. He's talking about. He was told not to. He was told not to encourage the students to break the law, and he just does that on paper. He says, "I'm not going to encourage you to break the law. I'm simply going to draw attention to the fact that sometimes when you do something disruptive, you can get people's attention. What is that if not encouraging children to break the law?" And then in another talk, he explains to them about targeting the tube. And he said that targeting the tube is in itself an illegitimate thing to do. For people to say that, his rationale is that this disruption is just a tiny fragment of what will happen if the whole tube gets flooded. There's no way that the tube's going to be flooded. Not in a place like London. I mean, look at this. This is the IPCC cryosphere thing, and they looked at the effect of adaptation, and this is right up to RCP 8.5. That is RCP 8.5 is business as usual to 2100, and it is only moderate effects on megacities right up to well above that. If the tick is with adaptation, and there's no way that London isn't going to be able to adapt to climate change. There's no way that it's just not going to happen. The tubes aren't going to flood. And then we look at their three demands. Tell the truth. The truth is to tell all this stuff that he's saying. Declare a climate and ecological emergency. They mean to tell them that we risk extinction. We do not. That's absolute nuts. They're telling them to tell their truth. And they're telling them to reduce zero emissions by 2025, and they must create a citizens' assembly. And this is an idea that these activists have decided amongst themselves that this is how we should do it. I say this deeply undemocratic to do it this way, to go and just have a particular demand. It's fine to have civil disobedience, which is drawing attention to an issue that you want dealt with. But they are requiring that the government pass this particular bill with these three particular demands enshrined into law, with the UK legally obliged to reach zero emissions by 2025 as part of that law, and to create a citizens' assembly which would have huge power over us. It would, the whole thing would have huge power over us if they did this, all just in order to stop them from disrupting services in London. Basically, that's their approach. I mean, this is not how you should do it. This is talking about how you get more problems than you solve. As Winston Churchill once put it, many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And they're basically, with the Citizens' Assembly, I know it's just about one particular topic, and they have various precautions in their bill. They say that even if it's a 2/3 majority in the Citizens' Assembly, the government has to do it unless it involves some financial budget that has to be increased in order to do it, or some effect on the people. So they could just say, we're going to redeploy the funds here to there, and you have to do that. It's not a budget increase. I think that would be one of the things they could do, and they could say, we've got to stop all the wind farms and do everything in solar panels. And this is a group of 500 to 1,000 citizens chosen at random. And they could just arbitrarily decide something like that. They're given a whole lot of they would be given a lot of advice from the experts, but in the end it's up to them. And if 2/3 of them decide something, in this group of 500 to 1,000 people who've just been chosen at random, why is that better than choosing politicians who you choose according to what you think, the ones who are going to be best at doing their job, and they campaign and they talk about their policies, and you discuss them and then you vote for them? Why is it better to do a citizens' assembly, even if it's just for climate change? But they would force that on us. This is not how to do this sort of thing. Why not put their weight behind the IPCC and the Paris Agreement? In one of his papers, he actually says he's glad that the US is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. He wants it to fall apart because he doesn't think it's going to work. He doesn't think it's the way to go. It's not fast enough. I mean, goodness me. It certainly will be beneficial to reach carbon zero before 2050, but Finland aiming for 2035, as I said, 2030. You can look at it and look at their manifestos very closely, and if it seems feasible, then let's go for 2030 if it's going to work out, if it's as good as they make it out to be. But 2050 is what the IPCC wants, and if we go ahead of that, not what they want. No, the IPCC 2050 is for the 1.5C. It's not necessarily going to be 1.5C at that point either. It could be above, it could be below, but it's a reasonable thing to aim for at this stage, because there's no cliff edge. We'd have to talk about that separately. But I suggest if you don't know about the background of this, do check my fact-checking errors and the cliff edge thing, and this article also about how we can grow food for everyone through 2100 and beyond in all scenarios. I didn't talk about that very much. Let's talk about that to end up. So back up, we'll be looking at our cereal. I'm not sure I have too much actually graphs about this, but I can just talk about it. Yes, our cereals there, and how we're doing all right with that. We produce about half of the food that we need in this country. But In World War II, we produced an awful lot more. And remember, since World War II, in the 50s and the 60s, we've had the Green Revolution. We've had a huge increase in crop yields. And the main reason that we can't feed everyone is because much of our land is put over to animals, to exporting meat and so on. Now, the Committee for Climate Change, we don't need to change this. They're not saying we have to change this. They have they think the main thing we need to change is have rotation farming, where you have the same number of cows as before, but they're in a rotation with normal crops and with pasture, so that this improves the soil. It takes a lot of carbon into the soil. It reduces the fertilizer. It improves the soil. It's better for biodiversity. It's all round the best thing to do. And I think it's not going backwards. It may seem like a backward step because that's how it used to be done. They say that that's the way forward, and that's how we should go. We don't need to do it, but if it actually came to it, we could ration people so that we don't so they don't eat so they have only a few ounces of meat a week, and if we did that, then we'd be able to feed everyone. So the worst case scenario that he was talking about, where he imagined the whole rest of the world didn't have any food to export to us, then that worst case scenario is where you have to ration your meat like in World War II. But that's not going to happen. The rest of the world is I don't want to explain this all again. I explained it in my last video, but sub-Saharan Africa, that's got about a tenth of the crop yields of the US and China, and it's the main place where the population is expected to increase, and it's the main place where we've got a huge potential for increasing in agriculture. And in many other ways, we're definitely going to be able to feed everyone, no matter what happens. And the main question is, do we do it in a way that preserves nature services, preserves the world in a good form, like it is today, and do we hand on a world to the next generation and the generation after that in 2100 that is pretty much as we have it now? And that is the main thing that as far as feeding everyone. And then all the other effects of global warming, droughts, hurricanes, so on, the increased risk of wildfire, the raising of sea level, and all that, those are very important factors. And but you don't need to worry that we will not have enough food for everyone. That's not possible in any scenario, although there is a risk of reduced food security if we are not very well organised as we go forward. But as we are now, things are looking very hopeful to me. I mean, and the young children who are with school striking young children, they are the face of our future. They are our future voters. But we must tell them the truth, tell them how things really are. And they will engage. The people I help, they become far more engaged once I'm with. They're not. You don't want them paralysed in the corner of the room sobbing, and committing suicide or feeling they should commit suicide over this. I mean, that's just so awful. It's just not true. There's a huge amount you can do, and in your own personal life, there's a huge amount you can do to help, like getting energy efficient appliances and. Reducing food waste makes a huge difference, especially meat. And also, if you can manage to eat, now not everyone is going to do this, absolutely, obviously, and there's you get people saying everyone's got to go vegan. That's not true. But if 20% of the population went vegan, but that's not very likely. But what is quite feasible, and the Committee to Climate Change thinks it can happen, is that in the UK, by 2050, we are eating a fifth less meat than we are now. And that could be, for instance, by eating one meat-free meal a year, a week. So I just come out with the wrong word all the time. A week. That is one way to do it. And if you eat meat with every meal of the week, then if having one day without meat, it's very good for your health. It's helpful. And it's also very good for the climate. Another way you can do it is by eating less intensive meat. There are many other things that you can do, but scientists have been saying this just recently in the last year or so. There's been new research that's made it really, really clear how much of a difference this makes. So that's the reason they're doing it. They're not doing it out of any personal conviction. Most of them are not vegan or even vegetarian. Most of them eat a lot of meat, but they have personally reduced meat because of this research that made it really, really clear that this is good for both biodiversity and climate change. It saves an area. You're talking about an area larger than the Amazon. I'm not quite sure. I was finding it a bit hard to figure out quite how much, but it's quite a large area, larger than the Amazon, and it's several Chinas if you were to reduce it by 50%, and you were to go for less intensive meat. For instance, cows that are not fed food, not fed grain that would otherwise be grown to humans, because we have some cows and pigs and chickens that the only thing they eat is food that could have been fed to humans, and especially with cows, that's very inefficient, and that is part of the reason why they took about the less intensive meat. That by itself makes a big difference. But there are many other things you can do. I should add it to the end. I'll probably talk about that in a separate video, and I'll add it to the end of this, that all these things you can do. And then of course press to our governments to go ahead, and all these schools striking children, they're going to go up to be the voters, and it's just great what they're doing. I just hope that we can get out of this narrative of extinction, which is just wrong. I hope we can get facts coming back. Greta Thunberg talks about, don't listen to me, listen to the scientists. That's what we should be doing. We should be listening to the IPCC. We should have the IPCC scientists on TV telling us what the report says, not the reporters. The reporters do not present what they say properly. You occasionally get scientists from time to time in the more specialist programs, but it's mainly the activists that are on TV. And the very few, there are some climate scientists which are a little bit activist, and the ones that say the more dramatic things, they get in the papers sometimes with the op-eds. Others, they produce papers saying that things aren't like this, and they just don't get taken up by anyone. And the ones who really call out the catastrophists, they're the ones that are least publicised. You don't hear much from them. So anyway, I hope this helps a little bit, and please don't believe any of this. It's absolute nuts, And let's bring up a nice positive image to finish it with. What can I do? No, it's the one I did. Let's bring up the Australia Conservation Projects one, and end with an up. Oh, and the 24 reasons. So all the conservation projects in Australia, and I'll bring up the 24 reasons, but I'm going to talk about these in the future. So these are for future videos. Bring up the online books and the 24 reasons. Yeah, so do have a look at these. Like here's my 24 ways the world is better. And then here's the positive. I need to get some more for this computer. I've been meaning to do it for a while. I just haven't got round to to ordering it. I'll do that right away. Right. Yes, you go and have a read at this, and this is about all the wonderful conservation projects that are happening in Australia, for instance. These are some of the ones they're working to preserve. It's the great challenges in Australia, but there's an awful lot of conservation work going on there as well. There's an awful lot of things going wrong in Australia, but there's an awful lot of good work being done there. So you can have a read of that. And then the 24 reasons, 24 ways the world is getting better. So I'll add those to the end. 24 ways the world's getting better. Child mortality way down, huge, close to universal literacy. Free zones, restoration of degraded land. But I've got lots of videos here about the restoration of the degraded land. This is the Climate Relief Fund, and that's the population levelling off that I was telling you about. That's about having less wars. Anyway. There we are, that's restoration of degraded land. If you want a bit of cheering up, then go and have a look at all these projects on restoring degraded land that's happening around the world. So much good going on. All this stuff is not really much talked about. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that.